The day I moved to residential Vale Verde turned my life into a real nightmare. As soon as I parked in front of my new house in this spotless gated community, I felt the weight of countless eyes watching my every move. The perfectly trimmed gardens and identical mailboxes created a disturbing uniformity that made me question my decision. From my garage, I saw a silver-haired lady striding down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, her posture as stiff as the rules she was so eager to enforce. Her immaculate blazer and stern look radiated authority. That was Margaret, although I didn't know it at the time. She was already jotting something down about where my moving truck was parked, her pen furiously scratching away on the paper. Little did I know that this seemingly peaceful neighborhood, with its white fences and pristine gardens, would become a battleground, and that woman with her clipboard would turn my dream into a fight for my basic rights as a homeowner. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. The first few weeks in Vale Verde seemed calm. I unpacked my stuff, organized the house, and started settling in. On the third day, I found an official envelope from the Homeowners Association under my door. It was a manual of over 50 pages detailing every single condo rule, everything from the exact height the grass had to be trimmed to the approved shade for the front window curtains. That same afternoon, my neighbor Sophie showed up at my door with a welcome cake. While we were having coffee, she warned me about Margaret, the association president. "She's been running this place with an iron fist for 5 years," Sophie whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. "She's already forced 3 families to move out because of constant fines and harassment." I tried not to give too much weight to Sophie's warning. After all, what harm could an elderly lady who was just doing her job of enforcing the rules really do? I spent the next few days finishing up the organization of my garage workshop. As a mechanical engineer, I work on specialty projects at home, and my workbench is essential. Over the weekend, when the truck came to deliver my equipment, I noticed Margaret standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, her gaze fixed on every single piece being unloaded. She was scribbling furiously on her clipboard while talking on the phone. At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. Sophie's warning echoed in my head, and I realized that my life in Vale Verde was about to change drastically. I decided to take a closer look at the association's manual. Among the countless rules, one in particular caught my eye. Garages must be used exclusively for parking vehicles. My stomach sank. My workbench had just become a violation of the rules. The next morning, Margaret knocked on my door. Her forced smile didn't match the stern look behind her gold-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Connor, I noticed you're setting up what appears to be a sort of workshop in your garage," she said, stressing the word workshop as if it were an offense. "That directly violates Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our guidelines." I tried to explain that it was a professional workspace, that everything would be kept organized, and that my car still fit perfectly in the garage. Margaret interrupted me, raising her perfectly manicured hand. "The rules exist for a reason. We don't want Vale Verde turning into an industrial zone." Before I could argue further, she pulled out her cell phone and started snapping photos of my garage. "You have 48 hours to remove all this equipment," she declared, practically spitting the last word. "Otherwise, you'll be fined $100 per day for each violation." After she left, I received 3 messages from Sophie. Apparently, Margaret was already telling everyone in the condo group that I was planning to turn my house into a clandestine mechanics workshop. Things were getting out of hand. I decided to reach out to William, one of the council members Sophie had mentioned who seemed more reasonable. He welcomed me on his porch and listened patiently to my explanation. "Look, Connor," he said, scratching his gray beard. "Technically, the rule talks about the primary use of the garage. If your car is inside and the workbench isn't in the way, I don't see the problem." But Margaret saw a problem. Many problems. The next day, I found a stack of notifications in my mailbox. Besides the garage issue, she claimed my lawn was 0.5 centimeters above the allowed height, that my curtains were an unapproved shade of beige, and that my welcome mat was inappropriately casual. At night, while sorting the papers on my workbench, I noticed a figure passing by the garage window. When I checked, I saw Margaret hurrying away, her silhouette outlined against the street lamp. That's when I decided to install security cameras. Something told me that things were going to get worse before they got better. The following weeks turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. Every morning, a new notification appeared on my door. Margaret seemed to have made it her personal mission to ruin my life. The fines began piling up. $100 a day for the workbench, $50 for supposed lawn violations, $75 for excessive noise. When in reality, it was just me working during normal business hours. I installed a full security camera system, 4 cameras strategically placed to cover every angle of the house. Sophie warned me that others who tried to stand up for themselves eventually gave in and moved away, but I wasn't ready to give up my right to work from home. One Tuesday, while reviewing the camera footage, I discovered something unsettling. Margaret wasn't just passing by my house. She was approaching the windows, snapping pictures of the inside, and once even tried peeking through the crack in the garage door. In one of the recordings, she was clearly instructing someone to dump trash in my yard in the middle of the night. The harassment escalated. My clients, who occasionally dropped off or picked up projects, started receiving stern notes on their windshields. Some neighbors, clearly intimidated by Margaret, stopped greeting me. Only Sophie and a few others maintained discreet contact. One night, while I was working on an urgent project, I heard a strange noise outside. Checking the live camera feed, I saw Margaret and another association member fiddling with my fuse box. By the time I reached the door, they'd vanished, but my power had been cut. Fortunately, my camera system had a backup battery and kept recording. The next day, I got a notice claiming that my energy consumption was incompatible with permitted residential usage, and that an investigation would be opened. That was the last straw. I began compiling all the evidence. Camera recordings, absurd notifications, exchanged emails, and photos of the vandalism in my yard. William, the council member who had been more reasonable, reached out to me privately. "Connor, you're not the first," he revealed, looking tired. "Margaret has a history of harassing residents she deems troublesome. 3 families have moved out in the last year because of her." He showed me a folder of previous complaints that were never properly investigated. Margaret had managed to hush them all up through intimidation or manipulation of the council. "Most members are afraid of her," William explained. "She knows everyone's secrets around here, but I had something others didn't. Solid video evidence. The footage of her cutting my power was especially damning." William watched all the material and shook his head in disbelief. "That's more than enough," he said. "I'm calling an emergency council meeting. It's time for someone to face Margaret." That night, while I was organizing the evidence, I received an anonymous message. "Give up while you still can. You have no idea what she's capable of." But I knew exactly what she was capable of, and I had everything documented. The war was just beginning, and this time, I was ready to fight until the end. The emergency council meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night at the community center. In the 48 hours prior, Margaret upped her campaign against me. I received a notification that my presence in Vale Verde was a threat to community harmony, and that legal measures would be taken to kick me out. I arrived early at the meeting, armed with my laptop and a projector. William helped me get everything set up while the other residents started showing up. The room gradually filled up. Apparently everyone wanted to see the showdown unfold. Margaret arrived last, wearing her most imposing blazer and carrying a folder full of documents. "Before we start," she announced as she took her seat at the head table, "I would like to present a motion for the immediate expulsion of Mr. Connor for multiple violations of our regulations." Her smile was icy as she handed out copies of her accusations to the council members. That's when I stood up. "Actually, I have something to show first." I connected my laptop to the projector, and images began appearing on the wall. The first video showed Margaret taking pictures of my house's interior through the windows. The second, her instructing someone to vandalize my garden. And then, the most damning clip, her and her accomplice cutting my power. The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret tried to interrupt, claiming the videos were doctored, but William shut her down. "Let him finish," he said firmly. I kept presenting the evidence. Contradictory notifications, baseless fines, threatening emails. Sophie stood up and shared her own experience of intimidation. Soon enough, other residents began doing the same. It was as if a dam had burst. Years of fear and frustration pouring out all at once. "This is absurd," Margaret shouted, her face flushed with anger. "You all cannot believe him. I've dedicated years of my life to this place, keeping our standards and protecting our values." Then an elderly lady in the front row spoke up. "You weren't protecting values. You were abusing power. My grandson can't visit me anymore because you said kids make too much noise." William took the floor. "As a council member, I propose an immediate vote to remove Margaret from her position as president." The support was nearly unanimous. For the first time since I'd met her, Margaret looked small, defeated. Before leaving the room, she turned to me. "You have no idea what you've done. This place will descend into chaos without my leadership." But her tone no longer carried the authority it once had. The meeting continued for a few more hours. I discovered that I wasn't the only self-employed professional in the neighborhood. There were writers, designers, and even a luthier who had been keeping his workshop hidden in the basement, all fearful of Margaret's reprisals. William was elected interim president, with a promise that fair elections would be held in a month. As I packed up my gear to leave, several neighbors came over to thank me. "You've done what many of us have wanted to do for years," one of them said. I left the community center feeling that an enormous weight had been lifted, not just off my shoulders, but off the whole community. Vale Verde could finally become the place everyone had dreamed of when they moved here. The changes at Vale Verde were immediate and surprising. In the first week after Margaret's removal, William organized a meeting to review and update the condo rules. This time, all the residents were invited to participate and offer suggestions. The new rules kept the essential standards of upkeep and safety, but they got rid of the absurd regulations that Margaret had enforced over the years. Self-employed professionals could work from home as long as they didn't disturb the neighbors. Curtain colors were no longer regulated. Kids could play in the gardens without the threat of fines for excessive noise. Margaret didn't take the defeat well. In the following weeks, she tried to rally some residents still loyal to her to contest the changes. When that failed, she started spreading rumors about how the neighborhood was losing its charm. But her words no longer held the same power. One Saturday, we organized a community barbecue, something that would have been unthinkable under Margaret's regime. It was amazing to see how people began opening up. The luthier brought some of his handmade instruments to show off. A lady who had hidden her paintings for years turned her garage into a small art studio. My workbench, once considered a violation, now attracted curious neighbors interested in my projects. Sophie had the idea to create a neighborhood talent directory. We discovered that we had a wealth of skills hidden right under our noses. Architects, artists, music teachers, chefs. Vale Verde was transforming from a sterile suburb into a vibrant community. William proved to be a very different leader than Margaret. Instead of imposing rules, he encouraged dialogue. When conflicts arose, he urged residents to talk things out and find solutions. The association meetings, once feared, turned into productive forums for discussion. One day, I found Margaret watching a group of kids playing in the community garden, something she would have banned in the past. For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of remorse in her eyes. She must have felt my gaze because she turned and looked straight at me. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, but her voice sounded more tired than bitter. "Actually," I replied, "I think the real value has always been in the people living here. We just needed a chance to show that." She didn't answer, just walked away towards her house. A few weeks later, we learned that she had put her house up for sale. Before moving out, she left an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Maybe you were right." Vale Verde continued evolving. The white fences and well-kept gardens stayed, but now there was something more. Real life happening behind them. Little creative workshops, music classes, neighborhood get-togethers. The uniformity that bothered me so much on the first day gave way to a different kind of harmony, one that celebrated our differences instead of trying to erase them. Sometimes, when I'm working at my bench with the garage door wide open, as it always is now, I think back to that first day and the fear I felt seeing Margaret with her clipboard. But now, when neighbors stop to chat or kids wave as they pass by, I know it was all worth fighting for. The transformation of Vale Verde continued in the following months. With the new management in place, the neighborhood found the perfect balance between maintaining its organized appearance and allowing the residents' individuality to shine. The official elections were held as promised, and William was elected president unanimously, with a diverse council that truly represented our community. Margaret's case became a hot topic in other neighborhood associations in the area. Representatives from other gated communities reached out to learn how we managed to shift from an authoritarian regime to a more democratic administration. William and I were even invited to share our experience at a regional homeowners conference. My garage workshop, which had once sparked so much controversy, now served as a positive example of how residential spaces could be productively used without disturbing the neighborhood. I even started offering monthly workshops for teenagers interested in engineering and mechanics. Watching these kids light up as they tackled hands-on projects gave my work a whole new meaning. Sophie organized a neighborhood talent festival, which quickly became an annual event. The luthier played on a violin he built himself. The artist who used to hide her paintings ended up selling all her work. And we even discovered that there was an award-winning chef living at the end of the street. The event attracted visitors from all over town and showed that a community can be both refined and lively at the same time. One day, I received an unexpected letter from a family that had left Vale Verde during Margaret's regime. They had heard about the changes and were considering coming back. "You've transformed this place into the kind of community we always dreamed it could be," they wrote. And they weren't alone. Other families who had left soon started showing interest in returning. The biggest impact, however, was on how the residents began relating to each other. People stopped hiding behind curtains, now in all kinds of colors, and actually started having real conversations. We discovered we had more in common than we thought, and our differences made the neighborhood more interesting, not less valuable. William introduced a conflict mediation system that soon became a model for other communities. Instead of automatic fines and notifications, issues were openly discussed and resolved through dialogue. The monthly association meetings, once dreaded, became eagerly anticipated events where ideas were shared and community projects took shape. The community garden, which Margaret had kept locked up most of the time, was revitalized. It became a lively space where families gathered, kids learned about gardening, and neighbors shared their harvests. We even set up a little outdoor library, a concept Margaret would have labeled inappropriate for our standards. On a Sunday afternoon, as I watched children playing in the community garden and neighbors chatting on their porches, I realized we had created something special. Vale Verde was no longer just a set of pretty homes with strict rules. It was a true home for all of us. And to think, it all started because someone decided to question rules that just didn't make sense. A year after Margaret left, we organized a special celebration at Vale Verde. It wasn't just any party. It was a celebration of our journey as a community. The community center was decorated with photographs showing the transformation of the neighborhood, including before and after shots of spaces that had been given new life. During the party, William gave an emotional speech about how taking on Margaret was only the beginning. The real challenge was building something new and better in her place. "We're not just living next to each other," he said. "We're building a community together." That day, we received some surprising news. Our story had caught the attention of a local magazine, which wanted to do a feature on how small communities can reinvent themselves. The article was set to focus on how we managed to keep the high standards of the neighborhood while creating a more welcoming and inclusive environment. The most gratifying part was seeing how at home everyone felt. Kids played freely in the gardens, older residents no longer lived in fear of breaking absurd rules, and self-employed professionals could work in peace. Vale Verde had finally found its balance. Later that night, Sophie told me she'd received a curious message from Margaret. She was now living in another gated community, but admitted that she missed the life that was now thriving in Vale Verde. "Maybe I protected the rules so much that I forgot to protect what really mattered," Margaret wrote. As I watched the party, families talking, kids running around, neighbors sharing stories, I looked at my workbench, the very thing that sparked all this change, and realized that, in the end, I had helped fix something much bigger than machines. I had helped fix an entire community. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. Today, 3 years after that first showdown with Margaret, Vale Verde is unrecognizable, in the best way possible. The houses still look immaculate, but there's a different kind of energy in the air now. The gardens are still tidy, but each has its own personality. The garages still house cars, yes, but also dreams, projects, and small businesses. My workbench is still here, and now I share the space with a monthly group of young apprentices. Seeing their eyes light up as they work on their first projects reminds me why I chose to fight instead of giving up. William remains as president, but he's already talking about handing over the reins. "A healthy community needs fresh ideas," he always says. The current council is a diverse group that truly represents the residents. Decisions are made together, and problems are solved through dialogue. Sophie has become something of the neighborhood's unofficial historian. She keeps an album filled with photos and stories of our transformation, so that we never forget where we came from, she says. The photographs clearly show our evolution, from a place where people lived in fear of breaking rules to a community where they feel free to be themselves. Last week, I received an unexpected surprise, a letter from Margaret. She wrote that she had spent a long time reflecting on her years at Vale Verde. "You managed to preserve everything I thought was important," she admitted, "but you added something I never understood: real life." As I read her letter in my garage, with the door open, as it always is now, I looked out at our busy street. Kids rode their bikes, neighbors chatted on the sidewalks, and soft music drifted from the luthier's studio. Vale Verde had found its own rhythm, its own way of being exceptional. And as for me, I'm still working at my bench, creating and fixing things. But now I understand that I helped fix something much bigger than machines. I helped fix an entire community. And that, more than any project I've ever done, is my greatest achievement. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this.